I like to leave behind something that means something to people, where people will listen or read or think about me and smile and nod and go, he was a good guy.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good morning, Germar Derron. Previously, episode 1516 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been just 2 years, 2 months, 12 days, and 14 hours since we last recorded that conversation. That was then. This is now. Germar, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you? That many episodes, and it's been that long. That's amazing to me.
Yeah. We've been having some conversations on the podcast across here. Thankfully, the team makes it possible. What's going on with your world? I mean, the last time we spoke, of course, the focus was on the podcast with the name that I find still addictive, right? Look to the Cookie
Right.
podcast. Amongst everything, I think there was a theme of there's like this lovable part of Germar, like Jack with this big heart, right? So, but that's just
I
my
like
insight. Well, there we go.
I like that.
So what's up? How have things evolved?
I mean, they have evolved. I'm trying to think when we last spoke. So I have always been in and out and up and down with the podcast, but not in a positive or negative way, more in a how I feel like life is moving me. Sometimes it is like the world needs this podcast, and I do 4 episodes a week, and I get a lot of listens. And sometimes it's back off. The world doesn't need you right now. And I do a podcast every month or two, and it's not as busy, and I'm not getting as many listens, and I just kind of go with the flow. And beyond the podcast, my life has gotten more, I don't know, consistent or mediocre as I've settled into the role of a professional in the theater world. So I have a regular day job that sees me working in a theater, a regional theater or a actually community theater. And my podcast now has been, I don't want to say pushed back, but it's more of a joy than a career, I guess.
I think the podcast, and you can tell me if you think this is not accurate, but I think the podcast was an extension of the individual's life, something that worked in alignment with who they are. And that's why it worked so well. And then it became this professional thing where it's the next radio broadcaster thing. Would you agree? Was it more of the previous and less of what it is now, and that's why it worked that well?
Wow, you hit me right in the heart. That's really close to something I talk about a lot. That is exactly the beginning of, or the history or the origin of the podcast. It was something that was different. It was an alternative. It was independent. It was close to your soul and heart and, your love. And now it is becoming a lot more like radio, a lot more celebrity driven. And it's just a little bit different than it once was. Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I was doing podcasting in the beginning in a studio. So we would visit the studio and record as many conversations as we could. And there was a pressure, right? Because we're on studio time. And
Right.
you don't even want to take toilet breaks because you're on studio time, right? And
Right.
it was totally disconnected from what it is now. Just being able to leave a room, put on the computer, call, and have a conversation. And yeah, I definitely love that. Saying that though, talking about your podcast, the last time we were talking, you were in Indiana. So is the theater work that you're doing in Indiana at this current time?
Yes, all the work that I've done so far in theater has been in Indiana. Although I have changed locations and theaters, I have remained in Indiana. And specifically, I am now in Michiana, which is the area that is at the Michigan-Indiana border. And there is a ton of live theater happening up here.
Interesting. Yeah, I was listening to one of your episodes, and of course, your voice is one that is captivating, as well as your tones, right? And
Wow.
I think there's a huge truth in the conversation. So let's dig into that, because
Okay.
that's a question I wanted to ask you about the voice. There, you said, sometimes I do 4 episodes a week. Sometimes I do 1 or 2 episodes per month. That voice, how do you discern when to listen to that direction or not?
That is a good question. And I don't know if I've put thought into it. And I don't know. I do believe in God, but I don't ever know if I feel like, oh, this is God pushing me, or it's the universe, or it's an inclination or something inside of me. But I really do. I'm open. I listen. Another thing I do, besides just listening to the wind or whatever it is I record a lot, but I don't post a lot. So I might record, I would say in the last, let's say 4 or 5 months, I've probably recorded 40 podcasts and I've
Hmm.
probably posted 12. And I just feel like I have a good a knack or just an idea of the world doesn't need to hear this. This is out there. This point has been made. It's been made better by someone else. This doesn't need my voice. And I will just hold on to it forever. And no one will know that it exists but me.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you're a true podcaster to the heart. So then, is it archived in a format that someone can listen to if they needed to?
Yes and no and yes. So there's a couple things I do. One thing that I have done is sometimes I'll put podcasts up or I'll post them or publish them and then decide, that wasn't quite right. And I will pull it from my website. But even though I pull it from my website, it still exists somewhere in
Hmm.
the online world on the web and people will find it. So people that are hardcore cookie monsters, they know how to find stuff that I've pulled down.
Hmm.
So that stuff still exists. And then also I have, a few different hard drives with just stacks of files. And what I like to do someday maybe is do a best of the rest or the best of what you missed and go through and maybe have someone else do it actually.
Hmm.
Select just some quotes here and there, or some pieces here and there, and put together kind of a hit list of podcasts that you never heard.
Understanding the life and death of an individual, how do you plan for your day? I mean, because it is possible you could die today or tomorrow, right? So,
Right.
how does that affect your planning going forward?
Oh, what a question. I think about this sort of a lot. I am on this line where I am terrified by the thought of death and just the finiteness, I guess, of this life or this world or whatever. And then sometimes I accept it, or I'm just on that line and I go, it is a part of life. Living is dying, and it's going to happen to us all, and it's always happened, and it'll continue, and there's nothing to fear. It's something we all should embrace. So thinking about sort of the legacy, I guess, going forward, is not. I mean, I do think about it a little bit, just not in a specific way, but in the way that I thought about it, especially as it relates to this podcast and what I do, I like to leave behind something that means something to people, where people will listen or read or think about me and smile and nod and go, he was a good guy. And that's about all I can do. That's the best I can probably hope for. And I do kind of take that seriously, which I think plays into why I might say, you know what, I'm going to pull that one down.
Hmm.
I think that has something to do with it.
Hmm. You're continuously evolving as well. Isn't that accurate? Like, I mean, when you listen to this episode and you listen to episode 1516, there's a fine difference, and I think it's challenging to pick it up because of how often you are recording and having conversations compared to someone that's jumping onto podcast once a year, right? So you're not hearing a ton of difference, but there is a difference. So the podcast, it is your therapy, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I've said that many times, and I do believe in therapy. I've had therapists, but I say that a lot. It's especially now as the podcast has evolved, because at one point the podcast was all pop culture, even though it's pop culture with my opinion and pop culture with some sort of racial or social justice implications. It was a lot of what's going on with Marvel, what's going on with DC, and it has shifted a lot from that stuff to what's going on with my relationships, what's going on with my family, how is my job today, how do I relate to people in the world, and it definitely there's an evolution, and I don't ever feel like I'm necessarily better, but I definitely can see different. When I
Hmm.
listen to some of the earlier episodes, I don't even feel like I'm that guy at all. I don't know if that guy's better than I am today or if I'm better than he was, but I don't even feel like we're the same person. We don't speak the same. We don't use the same terminology. We don't talk about the same subjects. It's a very different thing. It's very interesting to hear.
When we were driving through the US and Canada, the goal initially was we're going to meet 1001 Past podcast guests. And of course, I couldn't remember each person that I spoke to, and I had to listen to the conversation that I had with that person in preparation to meeting them. And a friend once told me something, and it flew over my head, but it was somewhere there. He said, the young man has to take care of the older me, right? So the young version of me has to take care of the older version of me. And in listening to those episodes, there were times where I would do exactly what you just did, where I would say, right, the older me. And then the younger me would say, right after on the recording. Have you found that to occur where the younger version of you, based on the archive, based on what you've listened in the past, is taking care of the older version of you?
That is one of the more interesting things I've ever thought of. I would say that I will listen from now on with that in mind. I've never heard of something like that. Because, of course, I mean, we might I think many people, I should say, think of the older version of themselves as the better, wiser version.
Yes,
and you think of the older person being the caretaker. So you kind of think of reaching back down and like, I would have done these things differently. And I've never thought of younger Germar looking out for Germar in the future, or even having wisdom or advice for today's Germar. That's just something I'll think about going forward. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. I got chills when you said it, the way you said it. Well, my friend, I can tell you that jumping in here, like, for example, your podcast accountability partner, Germar, did you do what you said you were going to do? And to know that you've not given up, you've stayed true to everything that you said on that conversation, I would dare say the younger you is really taking good care of the older version of you. My friend, this is an honor. Thanks for your service to humanity. You could keep every episode to yourself. Nevertheless, you share it.
Very cool.
Thanks for that. In closing, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
Oh, again, of course, thank you for having me back on. It's been great. This has been even better. So I appreciate it.
Germar Derron, folks, again, look to the Cookie podcast. My friend, thank you for being on what is inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by Pod Edits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.